So I tried to take a different perspective. The last talk, I tried to shift my perspective here. It took me hours to not present the same way I used to, and I hope it will be smooth. So some context. So I did my PhD thesis on level 1 visual perspective taking, so you will see the dot outline a lot. I did my thesis with Dana, which was about what influences perspective taking. And since very recently, I'm a professor of psychometrics. And that's why I kind of trained myself like as an exercise almost to, okay, you have to shift into perspective, into psychometrics, right? So that's why I try to re-examine research from a psychometric perspective. Although I'm a new professor, I'm not specialized in psychometrics initially. Actually, it's Dana who asked me to apply for the job, and I was lucky enough to actually get the professorship. So I still don't understand yet why I got the position, but here I am, and I know I'm trying to do psychometrics. And I haven't said it's quite nice. I will try to convince you that's actually cool. We'll see. So. You saw the title. My title is what is worth being measured in perspective taking? But before going there, I have other questions to ask. The first one is, what kind of perspective taking task do we want, right? And this can be answered from two perspectives, again. Let's say a cognitivist perspective and a psychometric perspective. For the cognitive perspective, which is, I guess, most of you, you would like something that is more objective assessment. You like to measure rather performance rather than self-reports, such as questionnaires, scales. You tend to have to use tasks that would capture universal trends, something like that show the same patterns of results across participants, something that's really consistent, such as the egocentric bias, the embodiment with the angular disparity. We also saw that today. You like tasks that document the manifolds and strategies of perspective taking. You would like tasks that would inform about what are the form-specific mechanism or the shared mechanism. And also you would like tasks that would measure true mentalizing, so not sub-mentalizing, because then what is it informing about theory of mind, and is it really comparable and so on. So yeah, it's not so good. It's something that is not really, that might be sub-mentalizing. So that's what I would call this approach towards universal patterns. And then there is the psychometric perspective, where as a psychometric person, I would like more like tasks that would capture how people differ from where people can really differ from each other on that task. So actually, I want to see that people show very different patterns of results. I would like also to see tasks whose scores would vary from one circumstance to another. Also tasks that would correlate with other perspective taking tasks that would predict what is going on in real life, or what could be called as real life. And why not also tasks that are actually useful, right? That help clinicians to better understand their patients, something that is actually practical. So I actually wrote on the right side here. These are psychometrics qualities that are actually well seen, of course, sensibility, validity, usefulness, and all that calls for an approach toward tasks that would measure individual differences. If you have a lot of individual differences, usually you have better psychometric qualities. Okay, so we know the task we want, but all perspective taking is actually measured right now. And this can be summarized to two kinds of tasks. The short ones that are very practical, that is measured mostly in social, clinical, and also in very old therapeutic tasks. And you have also what we saw today mostly actually, the more laborious experimental task that is really well thought, that it was mostly used in cognitive and developmental and psycholinguistic psychology. So if I can elaborate on that, you have this short and practical one, which is usually either self-report scales, or if we measure performance, it's often one trial, with a yes or no or something, yeah, left or right. Sometimes, well, we have more trials and we would measure the number of correct responses. But we would usually have only one experimental condition, maybe one control experimental condition, which usually we try to show how much we are egocentrically biased, right? And usually it's explicit. So we instruct the participants to take the other person's perspective. And what we can tell with that is that, well, the person failed or succeed, is bad or is good at perspective taking. And with the more laborious one, you usually have way more trials. You can also measure reaction times. You compare between experimental conditions, you have many experimental conditions. You also sometimes have implicit conditions, so non-instructed perspective taking. So you have very different kind of tasks. And you see there is really two worlds in terms of two kind of tasks that are used in different domains of psychology, unfortunately. And then the next question is the dot paradigm worth being used? And that's a tough question for myself, of course. And according to, I would say, a cognitivist perspective, in which we would like universal patterns, well, the first issue is that we are measuring a very basic form of specific taking, right? Line of sight computation. Is it really informative? Is it really interesting? As with more complex forms of perspective taking, as we have seen today, the stimuli are quite artificial, very simple. So does it? I mean, I often see people that are asking me, is something measuring? Is it measuring something social here? And then it's of course a debate about whether the alter-centric bias is actually caused by inferring a mental state. And there is evidence for the idea that it's domain general, and there is also some evidence showing that there might be some mentalizing aspects. But the trend is more regarding that at least we have to acknowledge there is both mental sensibility to mentalizing aspects and also domain general aspects. Of course, it's still debated, so I won't position myself on that. And the last aspect also is that the alter-centric bias varies quite a lot. Not specifically with this task, as you have seen in the other tasks as well, but you have some source of inconsistency here that is also problematic in this task. So overall, this task is quite criticized in the end. So should we keep using it, right? But let's use a psychometric perspective. And if we consider that indeed level 1 visual perspective taking is very basic, right? I mean, I can explain that. I mean, you know it, but like for me, and during the first year, the infants start already looking at where the other people are looking. It's present in other non-human animals, and it has been considered as the most basic, as a modular, and also first developmentalizing process. So if it's so basic, it seems quite plausible that in the end we should expect quite low interval differences on this specific process. If we do all compute line computation the same way, if it's in a universal process, then we should all be the same. And as Klaus mentioned, it's also not disturbed in autism, for instance. So it looks like we should all be the same on that. So we should expect low variability on this specific inferential process. I will explain why it might be good. Because if interval differences are very small on this very basic inferential process, and if it's criticized, then why should we keep measuring the egocentric bias, and especially the alter-centric bias, right? And my question is then, okay, can we measure something else then than the egocentric and the alter-centric bias? What if we exploit the full orthogonal design of the dot paradigm? So Usually, you probably remember, we measure the egocentric bias by comparing. You don't see the, no, you don't see here. Okay. You get the egocentric bias by comparing when there is a conflict of perspective versus no conflict, and when you have to take the other person's perspective. Then you get the allocentric bias when you have to take your own perspective, which is conflicting with the other person's perspective. But here you have to take your own perspective, right? So let's look at the orthogonal design. And what if we look at the main effect? You know, in the ANOVA, if you run the ANOVA, the omnibus ANOVA, you can have the main effect, which would be the main effect of congruency, which is always significant. Because you always have a very significant and consistent effect of congruency. So being you're slower, you make more errors when there is a conflict of perspectives. And and what it means, it's when you said interference, it would be an interference effect, but here it's a main effect, so it's irrespective of the target perspective. So I'm looking at the main effect, so I don't care whether it's conflict when you have to take the self or the other perspective, right? So it's basically the average of the allocentric and the egocentric bias together, merged together. I don't care whether it's egocentric or allocentric. I'm just looking at what is common, what is shared between these two biases. And then you can look also at the main effect of perspective, in which you don't care about whether there's a conflict of perspectives or not. You're just looking at, are you better when you have to take the self perspective versus the other perspective? So it's a perspective advantage. And you don't care about whether there is a conflict or not. That's just to wake you up. Prince, almost, but not yet. Soon. So it's important measuring the main effects of congruency and perspective rather than egocentric and allocentric bias, right? Because I'm trying to show you that there's a way to measure something else than the egocentric and allocentric bias. And if I have to convince you, these are the 4 questions I would like to for arguments. Does it better correlate with real life perspective taking? Does it better capture all people differ from each other? Does it better capture all perspective taking vary from one circumstance to another? And does it help clinicians to understand their patients' social difficulties? So I will examine these 4 arguments. Does it better correlate with real life perspective taking? I don't have an actual measure of real life perspective taking. The best I have is asking people to judge how they do in everyday life, and they have to report. Yeah, I try to look at every sides of the disagreement before making a decision and stuff like that. So how much they actually use perspective taking in their life. It's a self-report. And we all know that I guess this measurement is the most commonly used self-report of perspective taking. And this is the correlations I get with almost 300 participants on different aspects. So there is egocentric bias, almost a correlation, indicating that it's a negative. So you have, if you have a higher egocentric bias, you do less perspective taking in everyday life. Main effect of congruency, no correlation. Well, it's a regression, of course, but it's the same. It's conceptually the same thing. And main effect of perspective, here you have a very significant effect, indicating that if you are better at the other person's perspective in the task, irrespectively of the conflict, then you do more perspective taking in everyday life, as measured with this question. As you can see, is that the main effect of congruency doesn't correlate at all, but the main effect of perspective does. And that is way better than the egocentric bias. It's actually significantly better. Instead, does it better capture all people differ from each other? This is just an illustration of if I had the egocentric bias, just the egocentric bias, and I just plot the egocentric bias. I also did a cluster analysis, and you can see that, well, yes, people differ on the egocentric bias. What can you do? What you could say? Yes, some people are good, some people are bad at perspective taking. All right. What else can we say if we have actually the main effects? So I plot in a two-dimensional way the main effect of perspective, so being are you better at the self or the other perspective, and the main effect of congruency. So how big is the interference due to the conflict of perspective? As you can see, there is some tricks such as divided by the mean, also that it's actually speed divided by accuracy, so it's the inverse efficiency score. It's just to combine together speed and accuracy. So to better understand the axis, high mean high conflict, high interference. And then here on the left side means you are better on the self perspective, so you are basically more egocentric. On the right side, it means you are better to take the other person's perspective. Here we go. What do we see is that, let's say, first the horizontal axis. Well, unlikely what we would think, people are way not all self-centered. You can see that all this bunch of people are actually better at taking the other person's perspective than the self-perspective. There is quite some variability, and these people are very egocentric. And then you have also variability on the vertical axis. So if we do a cluster analysis, we have these profiles. We call them these other-centered, self-centered, conflicted or biased. And then you have flexible and non-biased. I'm still hesitating on the name, non-biased or flexible. Yeah. So what we observe here is that it's only a description, but clearly using this two-dimensional description with the main effects is way more informative. But what kind of profiles we have in terms of perspective taking here? Then the question is, does it better capture? So using the main effects, does it capture better or perspective taking vary from one circumstance to another? All I can say is based on the studies I've conducted since during my thesis and afterwards. And I conducted 6 studies with the dot paradigm, and I always ran the ANOVA and examined whether there is the interaction with the experimental factor. Does it interact with the main effects, or does it correlate with the interaction within the egocentric or antacentric bias? It always had an influence on an interaction with the main effects, never with the egocentric or antacentric bias. I'm not saying that's never the case. I'm just saying that on my observation so far, the main effects have better explanatory power. So what does it mean? So, for instance, if I induce guilt, the influence was not clearly on the antacentric bias and egocentric bias, but people were just better at taking the other person's perspective, respectively whether there is a conflict or not. Trait narcissism, that's going to be surprising, but it has been replicated. Showing that if you are more narcissistic, you take faster, you're better at taking the other person's perspective, irrespectively whether there's a conflict. If you force attention on the person artificially with some stuff, again, you have a main effect of perspective. Regarding shame, it's the opposite, it's on the other main effect. So if you are ashamed, you become more interfered by the conflict of perspectives. If you induce joy, comparison to sadness, you also increase the interference. Again, irrespectively of the perspective you take, it's a main effect influence. Sleep deprivation, Andy already showed that it had a main effect on the main effect of congruency. And then also, this is a correlation actually. We asked physicians, well, actually students with actual experience with patients, and they say whether they actually do perspective taking with their patients as self-reported was correlating with the main effect of congruency, not with any of the biases, or at least more with the congruency than the biases. I don't remember exactly. And then last argument is, does it help to use the main effects? Does it help the clinicians to understand their patients' social cognitive difficulties? And indeed, if you use this main effect, like the two-dimensional scale depiction I showed you, is exactly that with a cluster analysis. And what you get is different kind of profiles showing that in different clinical populations, you do find different profiles. I won't spend much time on discussing this because this is really Alex Bigot, my student thesis. It's really preliminary data, but it's just showing that we can find very, very interesting stuff, very subtle profiles of perspective taking that are spread around across these different clinical populations. So, what is growth being measured in perspective taking? I would say actually not the inferential process per se, meaning level 1 perspective taking, not really the egocentric bias, not really the autocentric bias. I would say the main effect of perspective and the main effect of congruency. Here, it's not that I have a really good name, but main effect of perspective, so I renamed it as self-order priority, and the main effect of congruency self-order distinction. What does it really mean? So what I mean by that is really the idea of by self-order priorities, just the processing advantage for self-perspective versus the other perspective. What is behind that? It's quite vague. I would say it's attentional priority. It's also social cues processing, whether you efficiently process that, whether you quickly access to mental representations about self and others. It's a big mix, honestly. So there is still work to do into teasing that apart. But it is worth distinguishing this from the other aspect, which is self-order distinction. Whereas self-order distinction is there for the whether you show interference, whether you show a bias, and then you have, in order to not show this bias, not show these intrusions, you have to have some cognitive control in terms of monitoring whether there is a conflict of perspective. You might need to shift, you might suddenly need to inhibit the irrelevant perspective. And these needs, these executive needs, are both needed in whether you take the self perspective or the other perspective. So this is really shared mechanism. There's also, I guess, also social specific mechanism. I didn't mention them because that's what I'm not trying to argue here. Do you read ideas what I meant by self-order distinction? What is main effect of groups? All right, almost. Drinks almost. We are almost there. So what is wrong then with the egocentric bias and the autocentric bias? I mean, I already explained that why I didn't find this better explanatory power with egocentric bias. My argument, I might be wrong actually, it's just my hypothesis, is that it's confounding three sources of variability. The autocentric bias is made of what I would call this self-order priority and self-order distinction. These numbers are made up, to be clear. And there is a small percentage that is this inferential process. I made it small because, as I said, it's very basic. So I'm expecting that the percentage of variance explained by the differences in inferential process should be small. But then what is left is very much influenced by self-order priority and self-order distinction. And I will try to illustrate why this is a problem. Let's say someone shows a high autocentric bias. If that person has this high autocentric bias, we have no idea whether this person has this bias because he's very attentive to others. And some authors would have interpreted that this person as, yeah, this person is very sensitive, so it's very adaptive feature, that's very good, and the whole discussion is written in that direction. But some other argue that this person really struggled to resolve the interference. He's really have failures to monitor whether this is to block these intrusions. It has very low self-order distinction. Basically, it's a very maladaptive feature. So basically, if someone has a high autocentric bias, you have no idea whether it's good or bad, and you don't know what's going on here. And the same actually for egocentric bias. You don't know whether if someone is egocentric, show a high egocentric bias, is it because he's self-centric, very self-centric, or is it because he's really bad at inhibiting the self-perspective, which is actually two different things. And so far, if we just look at the egocentric bias, we have these two elements that confound that would confront each other. And that, I think, would explain why sometimes by mixing them, we have less explanatory power. All right, so my lessons to remember, at least for myself, maybe it's for you also. I would say that egocentric and autocentric bias, at least in this task, confront two distinct perspective-taking elements, which are self-order priority and self-order distinctions. I would argue that the approach of decomposing into pure perspective-taking score is better explanatory power. By pure, I mean like with less confounds. Of course, as I said, within self-order distinctions, there is still a lot of things in there, and in self-order priority as well. So there is still work to be done to further decompose. But I think that's the direction to take to have a better explanatory power. I recommend, so you all have the data, all the people are using the dot paradigm task, actually not, and as soon as you have an orthogonal design with congruency and perspective manipulated, orthogonal design, you can reanalyze it and look at the main effects and whether this main effects has a predictive power, and the last point is that if you measure more complex perspective taking, it's likely that there will be more confounding variables than if you use this very basic inferential process. Especially what I mean is that with very basic process, which of line of sight computation, then you kind of certain, or you're more confident that the variance is not explained by that. And that's actually a good feeling. Whereas if you have a very complex kind of perspective taking, there's, as we have seen today, there are many strategies. We have toolkits. There are all kinds of rules, and we open a Pandora box as soon as we are going into more complex perspective taking. Of course, there's a lot to learn there. Depends on what are your objectives. But from a psychometric perspective, where we don't like confounding variables, it has a very, it's very interesting to look at basic inferential process in order to expect the lower variation on this aspect. All right, thank you for your attention. Let's have a drink.
I might have one question, but I might be wrong also, because I'm clearly less an expert than most of you on the dot task. But when you presented the two diagrams with artificial number, you know, and you said you can never imagine or guess correctly which part of the effect is due to self-order priority or self-order distinction, because you just have the general pattern. I was wondering if I remember well, some of you did a study 10 years ago with cognitive load, and in that study, we only observed one of the two bias, probably egocentric bias, again, if I remember well. And then you would only have one kind of the dimensions that will exist in your categorization of participants, and then you could guess. So maybe if you want to discriminate your participants on one dimension, you could use that type of paradigm and then be able to categorize your participants along one dimension. But I don't know if it's clear.
You are totally right that you can make, yeah, indeed, you can, the manipulation of the working with the high loading, it's a way to solve the issue with having more control in what is the egocentric bias reflecting, yes. But then you have to do that.
Yeah.
Where here, you just have to analyze it differently what you already have.
Yeah, but I was wondering if it's a good way to categorize subjects with an implicit or at least uncontrolled way to categorize between self-order priority and self-prioritizing subjects and other prioritizing subjects without passing by explicit questionnaires. Maybe it was to use that task under cognitive load, and then we have an objective measure of who are the person oriented toward other or towards themselves.
Yeah, it would be true. Yeah.
Right.
Is that another question?
So I'm concerned that I completely agree with you that we expect low individual differences in the basic process of level 1 visual perspective tracking, taking, whatever we call it, which means that any individual differences are likely to be due to other processes. But then what are we trying to measure in this task? If you then divide it up in the way that you've suggested, what we get out is measures of either this kind of propensity to focus on the other versus the self, or what I'd argue is purely interference attentional effect, which is that consistency congruency effect. But in that case, we're not measuring anything that's to do with visual perspective taking, which might be fine, but I mean, can we all just agree that there's going to be no variance in that process, and then this task is?
Yeah, we are not mentioning anything interesting about the essential process. We are looking at something that I assume that is present in any other perspective taking task, in any perspective taking real life situation, which is the need to prioritize information between self and other, and the fact that you have conflicts of perspectives. So what I'm measuring is not interesting in terms of it's not really mentalizing, but is what is next to it that would generalize to so to everyday life, and at least is useful for clinicians to better understand what is wrong with their patients. Because what is wrong it's not really interesting to say this person failed to complete the line of sight. Okay, then another task. Oh, this person fails to measure to calculate the beliefs. Okay, this person is bad at faux pas, so he doesn't get the rules of British structure. Okay, and then you keep going like that. I moved the inferential process. But that's not so useful for the clinicians, right? And these aspects are actually assumed, so far I still have to demonstrate it, present in all tasks and in all situations. So that's the interest. But at the theoretical level, to advance into theoretical research regarding the inferential process, it has no use.
Okay, happy with that.
I don't know which one. Klaus?
I find it very interesting, basically. So I was never a big fan of the blood task. Sorry, to put myself out there. So basically, I find it very interesting that looking at the main effects, it's actually sort of at least there are some interesting correlations, and that the inferential process, I wouldn't even call it an inferential process, but whatever the mechanism is not that interesting to understand in terms of mentalizing. Can you say a little bit? I found it intriguing that guilt was basically tapping into self-other priority versus shame into the self-other consistency or the congruency effect. What do you make out of that?
So if you in the literature, it's really interesting because we have all the hypotheses we set up in advance regarding emotion, what kind of appraisals emotions do. This is a really social emotion, and guilt, you can, when you feel guilty, it's because you did wrong that you can amend, you can repair, and you can repair, you can amend towards someone to whom you felt you did the wrong. With shame, there is no way to amend, repair. You all having that in you have this embarrassment, this shame, and you're stuck with it. It's really more debilitating. It's really hard to regulate shame, whereas guilt, the only way to well, maybe not the only way, but the obvious way to deal with guilt, to alleviate guilt, is to go toward the other person and say, I'm sorry, can I do something? And this is actually tendencies that is associated with guilt, and that's kind of reflected in perspective taking. Like really the focus, that you increase focus towards the other person.
Interesting. Definitely opens up the new avenues of inquiry.
Thanks. Ken, yes.
I was wondering whether you looked at the relations between these orthogonal measures and measures of social motivation. There's a sort of bit of an industry in trying to measure social motivation that is independent of the literature on perspective taking, theory of mind, and the sorts of things, I don't know how familiar this is to people. So the sorts of things that people do vary from, at the high end self-report of, how much you invest effort in maintaining friendships and that sort of thing, to at the other end, the degree to which you're distracted by, in a flanker task by a face versus a flower. That's like, and all of these get crammed together under the title of social motivation, which probably isn't quite right. But there are individual differences in people's performance on these sorts of measures, and some evidence of validity with respect to predicting other outcomes. Only some, but some. And so I just wondered whether, especially the self-other bias, might be related to measures of social motivation. So what it's not a game of labeling. I'm not saying that somehow means that yours has to be assimilated, but whether it's picking up on something similar.
I fully agree with you. It for me, the social motivation of the people strongly tap into the main effective perspective of this self-other priority or self-other bias. Yes.
Is that based on? Do you have data on that, or is it?
It's more intuition so far. Actually, I'm building right now. We just finished building social motivation for the it's a scale that measures all kinds of motivations to take the other person's perspective, including antisocial motivations and social motivations. Some that are also more dominant and submissive. We use the circumplex interpersonal model, which help us to we had like at least I don't know, at least 30 types of motivations to take the other person's perspective, and half of them are kind of pro-social, and we would like to see how does it correlate. But what helped me in that direction is really this one, because when you look at the subjective taking subscale of the interpersonal activity index, the scale is not about are you good at it. It's about whether you are kind of motivated to do it in everyday life. It's not about, the question is, I try to do it. I usually try. It's really about whether you're motivated to do it. So that's where my intuition comes from. But it still need to be clearly, nicely investigated.
I'd be very interested to hear how that goes. I mean, I had a bit of a side bet with my colleague Rory Devine, where we looked at individual differences in theory of mind in sort of middle childhood, and had measures, adolescents actually, had measures of social motivation there as well. I was sure that would account for all of any interesting effect the theory of mind would be accounted for by a separate measure of motivation. And it wasn't, they were independent effects, they were related, but there were also statistically independent effects too. So I kind of lost my bet, but it's probably more interesting. So
yeah, there's still a lot of digging into this. Here it's only at 2 elements instead of, so we are working actually in having more deconstructing even more, but that's going to be for next time. I guess that's it. Thanks a lot. Let's have a drink.